and welcome to the Huddle Breakdown. Another week without Alan, but another week with James and I, for everybody out there who doesn't get totally annoyed by us. James, how are you doing?
Like people sitting in prison, counting down the days. They'll have to endure another few days here of this horrible situation. But if they endure, it will soon pass. I
do promise Alan will be back soon. But until then, we will try and provide you with as much good content as we can. James, before we go on to the Celtic news, your beloved Union Saint-Gilloise lost a couple of days ago.
Cup. I saw that. Yep. I didn't know the game was even occurring, so I will throw my hands up. I happened to come across it when I was scrolling through FOTMob, I think yesterday for some ungodly reason, and saw Super Cup in Belgium. So yeah, they lost 2-1. Looked like kind of a coin flip game.
So the whole model isn't a bust then?
No, well, that's the funny part is they're competing against Club Brugge, who probably has 3 times their revenue. Mm-hmm. And they just won the league. So, to have coin flip situations with someone who's triple your size, to me, kind of speaks to what they're doing right. But yeah, there's no magic bullet. I mean, these people that say, oh, well, Brighton hasn't won the Premier League yet, Dave. How good can Bloom be? I was like, well, they have like the 3rd lowest budget, and for them to even get up into Europe is actually kind of remarkable in the richest league in the world, where there's like 3 or 4 huge clubs with tons of money that actually are reasonably smart, or in like Liverpool's case, really smart, now that they got rid of Klopp and he's not screwing things up anymore. So, yeah.
See, what I'm learning about you now...
That up, by the way. You just did that to kick me.
Yeah, well, no, what I'm learning about you now is that in an argument, even when you're proved wrong, you go, but see, that makes my point even more.
Exactly. That's how you win debates, Laura. You lie through your teeth.
Well, we will be mentioning Union Saint-Gilloise a little bit more in this show. We'll be diving into a thread that you put up on X or Twitter or whatever you call it these days a little bit later, where you're talking about some of the financial benchmarking against some of the other clubs that we would expect to be competing with in Europe. But before we do that, we will talk about the Newcastle friendly that happened on Saturday. I was there. I have to admit, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I will give my thoughts in a second, but James, what were your thoughts on whatever you managed to see of the game and what you read about it afterwards?
I think we're going to the Champions League quarterfinals is what I think after that. Mm-hmm. This is it was right away. You get the splitting of the parting of the seas, where you get the eternal optimists that are all worked up and excited, understandably, and then you get the dour jerks that are like, "Don't you remember the Wembley Cup season? Like, this doesn't mean anything." And it's just like, well, they're both kind of true. Like, we love to be. If you can't be optimistic at this time of the season, I think, allow some of that to flow in the veins is kind of my philosophy. And then when the transfer window slams shut, hypothetically, if it's yet another Celtic transfer window slamming shut, then we can all kind of have reality slap us up above the face. But this is the time to hope and dream, is my philosophy.
Yeah,
as I get ready to crush everything in my presentation coming up.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff coming up in that. Everybody will be glad to know. One thing I did want to do is talk about some of the individual performances in the game, because there were some names coming up from myself and others that I saw online for significant praise that you might not expect. One of them being Austin Trusty. He has shown himself in a completely different light, I think, with that game. He was very dynamic. Tackles were well timed. His positioning seemed great. He just seemed very, very commanding, and that was with Dane Murray at his side rather than Cameron Carter-Vickers. So what did you make of his performance, and where do you think it leaves him in terms of... Because I don't think many people would have been utterly shocked if he'd have been heading for the exit door this summer, and yet a performance like that suggests that there's maybe still a future for him at Celtic.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked if he's still exiting. I mean, it's possible. One doesn't know, but I I like to think that our loyal viewers, the people that are crazy enough to watch and or listen to this show over the last year, would already know the answer to that question, which is Al and I have talked about Trusty a lot, and it all comes back to these players oftentimes are good in certain ways, and then they have relative weaknesses. And the games when Trusty has looked the best is when we are more on the back foot on a relative basis. Like, I don't think we were being overrun or anything ridiculous. I mean, this was not like when we were in Bergamo against Atalanta, and like it was a one way,
Yeah. But we were on the back foot the first 20 minutes or so, yeah.
Yeah, right. So for snippets of the game, yes, but it wasn't like a total onslaught. But on the margin, he tends to do better against higher level teams that are more dominant on a relative basis against us, and where we have to defend our box. And, some of the nuts and bolts defending that he's pretty good at, and use his pace and fairly simple with what he needs to do, meaning that it's going to, and I don't mean that in an insulting way, I mean it in like an old-fashioned defending way, where he doesn't have to like defend, take possession, and then play two pretty little ticky-tacky passes with a midfielder to get the ball out against a counter press. It's just, get it the hell out of here. Like that type of old school defending, like he did at Atalanta, where he excelled in that game too. And him and Scales were tremendous that game. Because they were just defending, and they didn't have to do these intricate build up and a lot of that. So I think that's contextually, he was put in a position against an opponent where his strengths are profiled versus his weaknesses. And the irony of a player like him is that, like a midweek game against, I don't know, St. Mirren in Paisley may make him look worse than playing against Newcastle. As kind of odd as that seems, is because just what he doesn't do that well on a relative basis, he's got to do a lot of against the St. Mirren. And St. Mirren's, good enough and organized enough and aggressive enough when they press. His deficiencies on the ball with passing and ball carrying and ball progression, that's really where his weaknesses are, can create major issues. The other thing I'll say, this is why preseason's so kind of, we joked at the beginning, or I joked, I should say, about this, the Wembley Cup season and everything. It's impossible to know where the relative intensity is with these teams. So, I think Newcastle's just back in the training for the most part, a lot of the EPL clubs. So I could see us having a bit of an intensity advantage. We're at home playing against, in front of a big crowd. Our guys get to show off against the, the big time rich guys from the EPL. We want to show ourselves playing well versus, kind of glamour so-called club. And it's funny calling Newcastle that, but you know what I mean. Just any team in the English Premier League these days. So I think we probably get a bit of an advantage because we've been in training longer, more intensity. So he didn't face. This wasn't like the gangbusters Newcastle press. This was the preseason first game, like, hey, we're just trying to get into shape press. We don't really give a crap if we win this game. So, again, that probably also helped, make him look better. And again, I think he's a perfectly fine player if put into a system in a competitive situation where his strengths are going to be used more than his weaknesses. And I said it when we signed him. It's not at Celtic, I don't think, because our center backs have to be pretty good on the ball, or at least the mix. And that's the other thing, him with Carter Vickers, neither of them are good enough on the ball. Carter Vickers is serviceable, but he's not, a ball dominant center back who's going to really make things pop. So him and Trusty, I think, is not a great mix as like the core starting two. And I don't think Rodgers thought so either, because that's why Scales came back in, and that's his advantage over Trusty is, all of those areas I talked about with ball progression.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation because actually the most outstanding points of the match for Trusty were when he was making slide tackles or clearances, not when he was having and not having to carry the ball and do anything of that nature. So that's fair. Next to him in defence was Inamura, who I do wonder if Brendan Rodgers is slightly regretting what he said about him when he came in. The reason I say that is because I've no doubt, having seen Kieran Tierney come on and play the way that he did, that as long as Kieran Tierney is fit and uninjured, he will be our starting left back. The step up in intensity of the whole team was evident when Tierney came on. The quality of that ball for Scales' goal was unmatched by many other players I can think of in our squad. But having said all that, Inamura, I think, even though, as far as I'm aware, he's not naturally a left back, or that's not the position he was brought to fulfil, he's got the skills and the attributes about him to be a more than adequate backup for Tierney, especially domestically. And one of his strengths is his distribution out of defence, which we could always use to our advantage. I mean, what do you think of what you've seen of him? And do you think Brendan Rodgers is... I wouldn't want to say the word regret, because I very much doubt Brendan regrets anything that he does. But how much do you think he is rethinking what he said when Inamura came in at first?
I can only hope it's a serious rethink. I go through these player benchmarking exercise pieces with every player that we sign, and a bunch of them that we are rumored to sign each transfer window. And I was very high on Nygren, very excited about Nygren. Nygren's profile was kind of cut and dry, kind of like Matt O'Reilly when I looked at him when we signed him from MK Dons. It was like, okay, this guy's he's got like the total package, robust, very skilled broadly, and so I was very excited about Nygren. But when I looked at Inamura, he quickly became my favorite signing, and I doubt we'll eclipse that. And the reason why, and some of this is personal bias, I'm going to throw my hands up right away, which is, I think, and this is also an area, when I talk about the fact that we just don't live in spreadsheets, despite people, that don't like data or analytics. One of the tropes they often will throw is that, we'll just watch the game. Well, it's like, yeah, well, I kind of watch the games, and then I usually rewatch them, and I watch a lot of video and clips, and so I looked at a lot at Inamura, and what struck me right away, and I thought the game against Newcastle was a perfect synopsis, is there are some players that play chess and some play checkers. That's the way I'll frame it. And when people are on the ball, the simple passers, like a Trusty, they'll pass to the next available teammate. Mm-hmm. They'll play the simple ball. They're playing checkers. Like, it's just going to take the next step. Like, I'm not thinking 2-3 steps ahead, or I'm sure as heck not, bypassing that guy and making the better pass across the field to a guy who's also open, but that will create superior attacking angles and disorder the defense a lot more. And what you see with Inamura constantly is his head is up and he's scanning for that second and third order opportunity. And it's almost every time he touches the ball. And that's right away when I watched video of him, I was like, this guy has it. Like, there's not that many people that are playing the game that way. And I talk about it as, the deep line playmaker ethos. And again, it's a ridiculous analogy to make, but it's like the Pirlo orchestrator, the people that are just really great at identifying and having the risk appetite, and then the ability to deliver those kind of passes that are really disruptive to a defense. So I think I think he has that, and I don't know how great he is at it. I haven't seen enough. Like, I'm not going to say he's a world beater, but for what we paid for him, and the fact that already, and the other thing I saw when I looked at him is he was playing in a team that's defense was completely shambolic, like a complete mess. And, he looked like he was, fast, quick guy who was putting forth a lot of effort and who was not at all shy about getting in to be physical. Like, there was an appetite for physicality. He wasn't, kind of dainty or, worried about contact. He was really in it. So that to me, when you take all of that together, and the fact that he's relatively green, he doesn't have a lot of professional experience. To me, it screams raw materials to become a really good player with upside, ceiling. We always talk about, I should say we, but people talk about ceiling and floor when you player development. And I think his floor is very high because he's got these attributes. I think what he offers that Nygren doesn't. I think Nygren's pretty close to probably as good as he's ever going to be right now. Maybe a little bit more development given his age and that kind of thing. I think Inamura his ceiling could be really high. I think the question is, how do you use these talents that he has in our system? What's the most efficient, effective way? Is it as a left back? Is it as a defensive midfielder centrally where, there's passing and movement ability? Or is it at left center back? Now, what's interesting so far, and this is something I got 100% wrong in predicting and speculating on what might happen heading into the season, is, Al and I talked about the potential for maybe going towards a 4-2-3-1 with the personnel, and most importantly with Tierney's return. So far, what it looks like we're going to do is maybe swiveling Lustig, I'll call it, which is in possession, having one of the fullbacks play as a third center back with McGregor as the single pivot, and then alternate. So in theory, sometimes it would be Tierney staying back as the left center back in a 3, and AJ bombing on, and then alternatively AJ as the right center back directly in the Lustig role on the right side with Tierney bombing on. I think that's an interesting tactical setup. I think what's really interesting about that is that does suit Inamura. Like if Inamura is going to be that deep lying left center back with the game in front of him, that's kind of like, it's a deep lying playmaker type of role, and he can also invert and he can do all these other things. So if you can't tell, I'm really excited about what he could be. How much of that ends up getting channeled in a way that's optimal, I think, is where my concerns are, given the greeting that he had from the manager. And I speculated, it seemed like there was comments that he had never watched the guy, because if you spent any time watching his videotape, as the geeks say, watch the tape, man. You would have seen that the passing ability should not have been a surprise when you get him in the training. I mean, it pops off of his video right away. So that's my concern is, is he put in a position to kind of unleash this ability that he seems to have?
It seems to be a feature of Brendan's, and something that frustrates me greatly is this insistence on declaring who is a player that he identified and wanted in and who isn't. Because he's done it again with Yamada coming in. Even though he's been presented with evidence that perhaps, even though he didn't identify Inamura, he's still going to be of benefit to him. So why he's chosen to do it again with Yamada when we've yet to see how effective he could be in a Celtic shirt, I don't know. But yeah, I think Inamura, for me, there is a risk, like you say, that he doesn't get, his skills don't get applied properly. And I do worry sometimes that if a player is seen as being too versatile or too good in too many positions, then it ends up that he never nails one position down. And that could be a hindrance for him going forward. Having said that, until we know exactly what the settled starting 11 is for the season and how often he'll be used, that can only be seen as a positive at this point, because I would rather have a versatile player than a kind of very limited player.
Well, and, to your point, and again, I have no idea about this, but I'm speculating the fact that he has come in and played the way he has. And to me anyway, again, I'm no tactical, I don't even have tactical competency like somebody like Quinny. But it looks to me like he knows what the hell he's doing already. And that's not like a small thing. I mean, he's been in the door like a couple of weeks. He's never played left inverted fullback in our system. He was, kind of a left back and a hodgepodge left center back in a mess in Japan for the last 12 months. And so he's brought in to play this different role. And I can't, maybe he's doing stuff wrong that's driving Rodgers nuts. Like, I'm not seeing any of it. I don't know what that would be. Like, to me, he looks completely fluid. His movement looks great. Like, he's going into pockets of space, making himself available constantly to the teammates on the ball, calling for the ball. Like, when we're getting pinned deep, when people are pressing us, he's making himself available and then making smart passes to get the hell out, which is not something a lot of our players are able to do. So it seems to me he's probably a pretty bright guy. If he's able to do all this stuff that quick. I mean, you got the natural gifted ability maybe, but for someone who's able to pick this stuff up that fast and just kind of go with the flow that quickly, to me, he seems to be taking stuff on board rapidly, which is a good sign.
And to pick up your point about, okay, maybe Newcastle are just getting warmed up and getting back into the way of things, he still didn't look massively out of place. And the reason that I say that is because I went to James Forrest's testimonial against Atletico Bilbao, which again was not being played at a great level of intensity. But still, it's the one game that I've seen Kwon play in a Celtic shirt, and the guy looked he looked like a competition winner. Like, he did not look anywhere near the level of any other player on that pitch for either team. So I think even though, as you say, the intensity maybe wasn't there from Newcastle, there was still enough there to suggest that anybody who wasn't of the right level to play in a game like that would have been identifiable, and Inamura doesn't come into that category. Another player who doesn't come into that category is, surprisingly, Johnny Kenny. That he's the last one that I wanted to talk about in terms of identifying. Now, yes, he did miss a chance that was put on a plate for him at one point. The ball was put across the middle of the box, and I don't know if he fresh-eared it. I never saw the highlights back, but from where I was sitting...
he fluffed it, I would say.
So that was frustrating for him. But in a goal that I thought was highly indicative of everything that he was doing right in the game, his persistence is what led to him getting the goal that he got. He was utterly mobile. The biggest compliment I can pay him was that his pressing was on a level with Maeda, who was playing alongside him at the weekend. I thought he was absolutely relentless in chasing down the ball and closing down defenders and trying to make sure that that Newcastle could not get out from the back, and it created an awful lot of chances for us. And even more so to the point, his goal coming from the fact, for anybody who didn't see it, basically what happened was the ball was cleared up the park, and Pope comes out to get it, and essentially, I don't know if he misjudges the bounce of the ball or something like that, but the ball completely goes over him, and
it was hilarious.
And Kenny is basically, people can say what they want about him rolling the ball into an empty net. He was in the right position to be able to pick up on that chance as soon as Pope missed it. As a lot of other strikers would have seen the goalie coming out and thought, well, I'm not going to get to that because he's there. He stayed alert enough to react when that error occurred. And I think I came away from the game thinking, again, by no means am I saying Johnny Kenny is the solution to our problems up front, and I'm not predicting a 20 or 25 goal season from him coming forward, but if you're talking about squad rotation and trying to maintain freshness in a season where you're trying to go for all domestic cups and play in Europe, there's certainly a role for him in domestic games at home post-Europe to come in and just be a relentless nuisance against teams in Scotland, I would say.
Yeah, I've been pleasantly surprised at the quality of his build-up play so far in preseason. Now, again, all the caveats that we've talked about so far as preseason apply and not knowing the relative intensity of the opposition, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of the other players are playing in that same environment and not setting the world on fire, including, in theory, his direct competition for playing time at this point with Adamita. I think your comments about Kenny highlight two direct analytical points that I can make quickly. The first is Well, let me ask you a question to set this up. Do you think that a penalty kick is a sitter?
Yes.
Right? I mean, just conceptually, it's like, you better freaking score that. Well, we know only about 80% of penalties are scored. Okay. So that's kind of the ultimate sitter. Now, unless you're sitting like the shot's right at the central front of the goal mouth tap in, that's when you get up to, let's call it 95, 96, 97, 98, 99 type percent of a tap in, like a true sitter. What the vast majority of we supporters think of as a sitter are usually closer to coin flips. And by definition, guys are going to miss them half the time. And I'm not saying that with this specific instance. It might have been 65%. But the whole point is, if you're going to miss penalties 20% of the time, a lot of other shots, you're going to miss something where between 40 to 50% of the time. And inevitably, when they do that, we all throw our hands in the air and like, this guy's terrible. I can't believe he missed that. And it's like, well, it happens, right? That's kind of why we go back to.
Believe me, he was beating himself up enough about it.
And for a player, they should get that 100% of the time. Like a competitor is going to want to score that 100% of the time.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to bring that up because it's a constant. It's one of these insights that something like a good XG model can really quantify. So actually, how good of a chance? Like, what should that have been probability wise? And I always talk about, like, we don't think in probabilities. Most of us, we think in fight or flight binary terms. So he should have made it. Like, if it's 51%, he should have made it. Well, that's not how the world works. And then the second part is I mentioned this earlier about the importance of profile fit relative to Trusty, and what that might mean for Inamura depending on where he plays. I've talked about this endlessly over the last year plus with Ida. I joke, I've evolved this analogy, a horrible analogy, to it's like Joe Pesci getting cast as Romeo in Romeo and Juliet. It's like, Joe Pesci is a great actor, one of my favorite actors of all time. I'm not sure I'd cast him as Romeo in a romantic, like, Shakespearean movie. And so I think Ida has very distinct positives. I think that's mostly as an in-the-box striker. And by all accounts, that's what Yamada is as well. And we have a manager who seems to like to play a different way with his striker, at least one striker, dropping deep, being involved in build-up, turning in, half turn, carry the ball, play it wide, that kind of stuff, like Dembele did in his first tenure so well at times. Ida's not good at that. Like it's not the inverse of my comment about XG with the Kenny opportunity is that doesn't mean he's going to screw up every time. It means that on balance, relative to other strikers, he screws up more than average. And I would argue in certain aspects, a lot more than average. He's actually quite poor in certain aspects. Whereas Kenny, I think I'm coming around to the idea, well, geez, maybe Kenny's our best hold-up striker. And that introduces a really weird conversation, which I doubt is going to happen. But again, I will say, and we'll get into this when we talk about the last segment, is the importance of getting profiling correct relative to role. And I've talked about this a lot in the last year, is that has been a chronic weakness for Brendan Rodgers and Brendan Rodgers clubs, going all the way back to his days at Liverpool. Ian Graham's talked about it publicly. And, having lived and breathed this now for 2 seasons, I'm still seeing similar issues. So, the fact that we have Adam Ida, a guy who's really a penalty box striker, but because he's big and fast, he's our pace power hold-up striker. That's an issue. So, like, I'm open to the idea Yamada could be our best penalty box striker coming in, and Johnny Kenny would be our alternative hold-up striker. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. But I think from a profiling perspective, I could see that scenario actually being plausible. And I would not have said that 6 months ago. I mean, I'll throw my hands up 100%. Like, I was not really even that interested in looking at Kenny. But he's looked good enough in preseason. I'm like, wow, like, this guy might. And some people, human development is not linear. So people develop at different times. So maybe he's a late bloomer. Like, I don't know. But it's not like he didn't score bags of goals in the Conference League with Shamrock Rovers. Like, he's really come on in the last year. And so maybe he's just a late bloomer. And in a perfect world where, transfer fees and politics and all this other stuff didn't enter it, just based off performances. Like, I'd be interested to see, if you hooked Brendan Rodgers up to a lie detector test, who's been the better striker between Ida and Kenny in training and then in these games. Like, I'd be curious what the answer would be.
I think the thing that frustrates me, and I saw it again when Ida came on in the second half against Newcastle, is at a very base level, and again, this is an unquantifiable thing, but this is just an impression that I get watching. Kenny is playing like a guy who knows that he's got an opportunity here to try and force his way into the team, and knows that it's probably the biggest opportunity he's ever going to get in his career. Ida is playing like a guy who isn't even aware that his position might be under threat, I think. And I'm not making any... I don't know the guy. I'm not making any aspersions on his character. But I would think that if you were self-aware enough to read the situation as it is, then if you're Adam Ida, you must know you are far from the automatic first pick, and there are people breathing down your neck and players coming in that are potentially going to mean that you're going to spend the majority of the first half of the season at least on the bench if you're still at the club.
Yeah, I won't disagree with any of that. I mean, I could see from a purely human element perspective that upon Kyogo's departure in January, one could see themselves. If I'm Adam Ida, I would certainly think that I'm next in line to become the man who's going to be the starting number 9. And that was kind of choppy, shall we say, for the rest of the season. But, the manager's been pretty clear that he wants Maeda out left, regardless of what Alan and I think, and some other supporters. I mean,
and me.
Right. Well, again, who cares what we think? I mean, the manager's going to decide what he wants, but, I would think that after having gone through that, after Kyogo's departure, that maybe he'd be, chomping at the bit, so to speak. But again, I don't know how. This is where you get back into this issues of, people have different demeanors, and it's hard to see through confirmation bias, because I'll admit, like, every time I'm watching and I see him give the ball away and build up, or a ball bounce off of him and his first touch not being great, like, it feels worse to me, because I'm like oriented to see that more, because I have this anchored bias on, him being deficient in those areas. So, it might just be, picking up on some of that other stuff, and maybe he is trying as hard as, like, maybe he's 100% fighting for the job. And now Alan's speculating maybe it's him trying too hard. Like, I get all these things are plausible, I think. But I think, I'm actually I'm pretty positive on Yamada if he's going to be played as a penalty box striker. But we'll see. Like, I don't know what the plan is. It sounds like it's not a joined up plan, though, for your comments earlier about Rodgers not really seemingly involved in this one much. Again, kind of like Inamura. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, I was listening to I think it was the 20-minute Tims that were talking, and they were having a discussion about whether Brendan might be slightly old school in assuming that as manager he should have a say on every player that enters and exits the club, whereas in actual fact the more modern approach is that the head coach comes in and coaches the team, and the club has a policy by which they recruit the players they want to recruit to fit the style that they want their team to play. So whether there's a clash between old school thought and new school thought there, which I accept as a possibility. What I can't accept is that the manager is so publicly pronouncing his negative thoughts on whether that might be the case or not. Yeah,
it's hard to know. And again, I try to be charitable to people as much as I can. Character flaw. A lot of times I'm not, but I can understand from Rodgers' perspective that first window he came in, he basically, kind of signed on for the club doing the recruitment, and it was an absolute disaster. Mm-hmm. I mean, that we're just sweeping out all of the players. I think we're getting close to most of them being vanquished from the wage bill, at least on loan, if not outright sales. I mean, there's not much left, I don't think. So, I could get an insecurity there. And again, his predilection historically, he's not been the most analytics embracing manager. Again, dating back to Liverpool, but even at Leicester, there was kind of mixed stories on that front. So I kind of get it. I think from a fan perspective and people who kind of eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, and then even more so relative to seeing us through the purview of analytics, I have no clue who's making these decisions. Like, there's no transparency. Is it Tisdale? Is it Desmond? Is it some of the people that are scouts? Or who actually made the decision we're signing Inamura? Mm-hmm. I mean, who knows? Like, it's a complete, I'm guessing it's not, at that price nowhere near the Desmond level, but if I had to gamble, I'd gamble on Tisdale. But at the fan event, he just said he just started looking at recruitment like a short period before then. So, did we just come up with this name in the last 2 months? That's not usually how Celtics worked either. Celtic usually takes a long time to scout people and kind of build lists and stuff from all the the reporting and the interviews I've heard and read over the years. So yeah, we just don't really know is the answer. So it's hard for me to be too critical of Rodgers with that vacuum, because he's probably going to know who's involved, and maybe he thinks those people are crazy. I don't know. And after what happened that first summer, like I kind of get it if there's some friction there.
Yeah, I doubt we're going to get any closer to the truth of what the matter is anytime soon. We can only hope that we get some signings in soon, because I came across an old tweet of mine from basically about this time last year, where Brendan gave an interview post a training session talking about we'll work with what we have and we'll this and that, and I went off in one saying this is ridiculous and how do we still work this way, and here we are again. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. But let's leave the Newcastle game and talk of transfers to one side in a way for the second half of the show. James, you on Twitter shared a thread talking about the financials of inflation and how it affects football clubs. You have applied that to the benchmarking processes that you like to use to compare us to some clubs that should be the clubs that we are competing with. It was a really interesting thread, and I got a lot from it in terms of, maybe clarifying for myself some truths that I thought were maybe different in terms of where we stand in comparison to other clubs. So I guess for the second half, we'll maybe go through some of those facts and figures that you've gathered and see where we actually are in comparison to clubs that we think that we should be competing with. For anybody listening, obviously there are going to be graphics associated with this that you might not see if you're not watching on the YouTube channel, but those graphics will be included on the huddlebreakdown.com with the output of this episode. So if you want to head there and look at them, or if you want to head to the YouTube channel to look at what we're going to be talking about here, then feel free to do so. James will do his best, I'm sure, to explain for the audio-only listeners what we're looking at. So, James, why don't you take us through your PowerPoint?
Oh, boy. Well, first of all, I want to give credit to Harry Brady from Celtic Underground. His column that he wrote at their Substack, which I subscribe to. I'm a paid subscriber, and I encourage people to subscribe. They have a free tier as well for those who are unable or unwilling. So he wrote a column there about inflation in football, and how challenging it is for that to be navigated. And I have basically 25 years of professional experience dealing with analyzing this kind of stuff. Like, that's my wheelhouse. Bit of a financial historian, economics historian. And so it just caused me to repackage this conversation that I've had and what I've talked about and written about and shared with subscribers and spoke about on this show in a different way through the lens purely of inflation. And that's, and this is not specific to Celtic, which is generally in an inflationary environment, a rising tide lifts all boats in nominal terms, meaning that as prices are going up, everything's going up. Like it's so if you're a business person that runs a business, you're raising prices because your costs are going up just like everybody else. And your revenue, your top line's going up. It doesn't mean you're making more money necessarily. Sometimes actually, it can be harder to make money depending on what goes on. So if you're just looking at the top line growth, for example, a lot of that's just because of inflation and that kind of thing. And inflation has a very specific kind of way that it works through the economy. I don't want to get into the politics of it or the economics of it, but too much. But inflation really is just an immoral, horribly regressive tax that hurts the most vulnerable in society the most. So, but we've been in a hugely inflationary environment. Post global financial crisis, when governments went berserk with expanding money supply, and then we entered Banana Republic territory after 2020 with all of the fiscal spending that got paid for with monetary expansion, basically, for paying for people to stay home and all that kind of stuff. So, and they haven't pulled that back, by the way. All that emergency spending, they've just keep piling it on instead of, actually getting things back to normal levels. So that inflation has been all over the place, and it's also manifested in football for different reasons. Media rights being a big part of it, Champions League money, but things have really gone into overdrive the last 10 years. So what I've done every window for the last few years now, is I've built a custom benchmark of other clubs in Europe that we kind of compete against, I think of as our peer group, and look at how our player trading's been done. And the question is, as an analyst, like when I'm looking at a company and I'm looking at their financials, if I want to buy or sell their stock or whatever, I'm like, well, how well have they been managed? Well, you try to figure out how much of is it because they're making more money because of inflation, or are they making more money because they're actually managing the business well? So that's kind of the backdrop for this, and I'll get to the point up front and then build out the information. Is that I think that the reputation of Celtic being one of the best managed clubs in football, I think, is just not well supported. I actually think it's probably the opposite of that. I think we've been a huge benefactor of inflation, and that's being misattributed to competence. So I want to start with this first slide. Oh, geez, I said first slide, and I put the wrong one up. There we go. There we go. How's that, Laura?
That's looking good. That's looking good.
First class presentation skills. So I actually didn't share this one in the Twitter thread, but I thought I would add it to this because it's basically looking at why you would look at Celtic as the omnipresent player trading model in Scotland, which is the reputation. It's a fact. It's inarguable. So what I've done in all of this is I've gone back to the first season of Brendan Rodgers' first term, the Invincible season, 2016-17. It's not arbitrary. It's kind of the first season when analytics became omnipresent in the transfer market, I would argue. Maybe the season before, but it's somewhere around there. And then look at some ways of measuring player trading activity. So you can see what total volume represents. And basically I have Celtic, Rangers, Aberdeen, Hibs, and Hearts. So those are the big clubs in Scotland. So if you're going to benchmark domestically, these would be the clubs that you would measure yourself against if you're Celtic. So you can see what total volume represents is all of the players bought, all of the players sold over that entire period. So I think it's 9 seasons through the January window in 2025. And you can see that Celtic are at 421 million. This is all in euros, by the way. I did it all in euros because doing it across countries in the benchmarking. So that's important to recognize.
And just to clarify that for anybody who is numeracy illiterate like me, that is not 420 million profit for that time period. That is the addition of the sales plus the addition of the purchases altogether.
So far this window it would be 19 million for Kuhn plus what we've spent, which is like 3 million or whatever it is in aggregate. So the total volume so far this window is like 22 million euros, something like that. Yep, you combine both. And what that is, and I'll show that on the next slide, is basically, to me, that's the rising tide lift all boats gauge. That's the inflation gauge, which is as prices go up in the marketplace, whether you're buying or selling it, everyone's got to deal with it. So whether you're, if you're a widget manufacturer and you got to buy raw material to make your widgets, if the raw materials are going up and you're charging more for your widgets, like it's coming and going, like everyone's paying higher prices than inflation. So what you see here is Rangers are dwarfed by our total volume. They're at about 174 million. And then you go down into Aberdeen 35, Hibs 21, and Hearts, sub 8. Hello. Calling Tony Bloom 8 million in total volume over the last 9 years. That is, for it being one of the, arguably the third or fourth largest club financially in the country, and they have less than 8 million euros in total player trading volume in 9 seasons. That tells you the operating environment in Scotland, and also why someone like Tony Bloom would say, hey, maybe I can go disrupt that. But I'll come back to that. The next column is basically total profits. Okay, that's how much. So this goes back to, now I also want to distinguish this. This is basically just looking at what's on transfer market, buys versus sells. That is not the same as accounting profits that are reflected in the financial statements that are reported to authorities, because there's all kinds of things with accounting there, with amortization. I don't want to get into all that. That's a quagmire. So this is an exercise to try and benchmark. This is not,
and it's transfer fees only. It's not including player contracts and
the data on transfer market is not forensic. There's some issues there. I had to correct one that I knew was wrong, and I did it in my calculations. As Alan and I often say, when it comes to analysis, it's about accuracy, not precision. Right? Data quality, models, there's always issues with all of this stuff. What you're trying to have is a good faith effort to be as accurate as possible. And I think when you see ultimately with the rest of these visuals, the orders of magnitude of what we're dealing with here, if there's slight inaccuracies or even material inaccuracies, they're not going to be big enough to really change the analytical conclusions that we'll get to at the end of this, hopefully. If I do my job here. So then basically the profit margin, again, this is, I'm label it profit margin. It's not an actual profit margin that flows through to this is strictly a mathematical calculation to try and gauge how profitable the player trading has been relative to the volume. So all it is taking the total profit and dividing it by the total volume, and that gives you a percentage. Okay, I'm calling that quote unquote profit margin. What we see there is Celtic's profit margin's been about 11%. We see the complete basket case that Rangers have been. They've actually had negative profits of 30 million, roughly, negative profit margin, obviously. Aberdeen, Hibs, and Hearts. Aberdeen has started to get their act together a little bit. Like you can see, they've made 4.5 times the volume of player trading relative to, let's say, Hearts. And they have a pretty good profit margin of almost 45%. So they're at least going in the right direction. But again, at only 35 million, it's not a big number. And we'll get to that when we... So I think they're making some strides from a very low base is how I would kind of characterize Aberdeen. Hearts, irrelevant. Hibs, largely irrelevant because their turnover has been so low. But again, Hibs looks like maybe they're starting to, behind Aberdeen, incrementally getting better, and they have the Black Knight Group involved now, so that could change pretty quickly. The last column is something I'll get into later, but I call it the board to supporter ratio. I'll explain that in a little bit, so we'll come back to that. So, Laura, any questions on that before? I'm going to use you as the audience. And
Well, one thing that I thought was helpful that you explained, because we did go through this before we started recording, I was very impressed initially by the profit margin of Hibs. But as you said, that is much easier to skew
could be
based
one
on the
sale.
Yeah, one sale over a 10-year period for Hibs where they have one star kid who goes for 5 million.
Right.
Is going to massively affect your profit margin much more than Celtic, who out of their 400 million volume are maybe selling a 25 million pound player or something like that. So it's just
Right.
although on the face of it, people might say, well, Hibs are operating a much better business model because they've got a higher profit margin.
Yeah.
Actually, it's just that the numbers skew in their favour in that case if they have one good sale in a generation, basically.
Yeah, a lot of that was John McGinn.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, that, to be frank, so that's, you're right. So it's the profit margin itself is not necessarily a key metric. I think it's part of it's an important one relative to the broader picture. So now we're going to zoom out and say, okay, well, this is a clear picture. I mean, this is a dominant Celtic. Not that, the profit margin isn't setting the world on fire relative, but we just talked about that. As you scale up in a business, sometimes it can be harder to extract profit margins. But these are all so clear picture, dominant. That's the reputation Celtic have. They're a good player trading model. Well, if you're only looking in Scotland, that's not a crazy view based off of this information. Now let's move to Europe. So this is what this graphic is. It's called the Celtic player trading benchmarking relative to total trading volume. So again, it's that first column, total trading, all volume of buys and sales. And I've created a custom benchmark, top club Sporting, reasonable, a recent name that we just saw out of Portugal. I've backed out. Some people will include like Ajax, Benfica, Porto. I don't, because I think they're so detached from Celtic because of some very specific circumstances with youth development with those clubs. I think it distorts the graph too, because they've made so much money in player trading. Like to me, it's not helpful analytically to include them in a benchmarking exercise like this. So what you'll see here is, big clubs relative to non-Big Five leagues. So you've got Sporting, Salzburg, PSV, Club Brugge, Fenerbahce, Galatasaray, Anderlecht, Feyenoord, and Braga above Celtic. I think reasonably most Celtic fans, but yeah, they're pretty big clubs. Their financial resources, they might have more money because of local media rights. A lot of them are involved in Europe, Champions League in and out, or even consistently. So you would say, okay, those kind of make sense. And then as you go down, you see smaller clubs, in smaller countries, Zagreb in Serbia, Midtjylland in Denmark, Slavia Prague. So I've included a kind of broad basket across geographic regions to have a representative sample in this benchmarking exercise. So I think this, total player trading volume, again, that's the rising tide lifting all boats. As prices go up generally, all of these clubs are going to see these numbers go up. It's like a big group that goes up. The question becomes, well, what are you doing with it? Are you one of these operators that's making more money because of the inflation, or at least preserving what you're making during that environment? Or are you having a little bit more of a rough time? So the next slide is profits. So again, there's this, remember, about 430 million, was it 430 for Celtic? 48 million in profit. Here again, we rank this by profit now. Okay, so we had total volume, now we have profit. And you can see, well, all of a sudden Celtic kind of worked their way down to the point where we're just barely beating Bodo Glimt, which is a really small club compared to us. And another club that, from a good league, Olympiacos, big club, PAOK right above us. Again, Red Star, but again, Red Star is like 25 million above us, almost 50% above us as you go through this visual. So the top, and again, for people listening, Salzburg's at 403 million euros in profit. Okay, so they've made almost, about 9 times what we have in player trading per transfer market over these 9 seasons. And then you have what I call the or Alan will say in his graphics, the corner of sadness. I call it the basket case group in this visual, which is the honorable mention to the Turkish clubs, which are always a financial basket case. I don't know how they're doing it. I don't know if it's a government thing that they're involved with, but they just constantly lose money and continue to spend it. We just saw it in this transfer window. It looks like it just spent 80 million on some striker or something. It's crazy with what from one of the clubs, but another big name in that group, in the basket case group, there's two familiar ones: Ferencvaros, which we've all remember, unfortunately, and then Rangers. So again, if you're benchmarking us against Rangers, you're benchmarking us against a basket case club. Like, they're in this corner where really bad financial management takes place. So this is just profits over the period. Now we're going to move to profit margin. So again, this, I think, speaks more to, okay, based on what's your profits relative to the amount of activity you're doing. And I think this gets you closer to, clubs that are being run a little bit more smartly, I guess you would say. Now, there's some nuance there. Like I said, it's not a perfect metric. Sometimes profit margins go up faster because you're working off a very low base, that kind of thing. But here you basically see that we have the lowest profit margin out of any club other than the basket case group, where they're all negative. So we have the lowest positive profit margin. And again, we're kind of near Olympiacos. Club Brugge is only a couple of spots ahead of us, but again, they're almost double our profit margin. So that's the disconnect. And then the highest profitability is up closer to 50%, 40 to 50% profit margin, which is like 3 to 4 times more on a rate basis than we are. So
the one thing I would say about that, though, looking at that is, and this is not me making excuses for Celtic, like the statistics are statistics, but when you look at that, for anybody listening, Dinamo Zagreb topped the player trading profit margin 2016-17 through 24-25 at 62.84%. Now, I don't know enough about the inner workings of Dinamo Zagreb or the TV deal that Croatia has or anything like that.
Yep.
But I do think what plays into this a little bit, and feel free to correct me on this if you're wrong, is there's a certain amount of cachet associated with certain nations and the perceived ability of players coming from those nations that will benefit those clubs. So Dinamo Zagreb, for example, are producing Croatians. Croatia tend to perform strongly on the international level. There are always Croatians in every generation since their inception in 1992 at the very top of the European game. And so people are always looking at Dinamo Zagreb as a potential source of the next Luka Modric, the next Davor Suker, the next Boban, or whoever you want to call it. And so regardless of how that club is being ran, I think the fact that it's a Croatian club entices bigger clubs to come in with bigger transfer fees for their players than we would ever be likely to attract. Is that unfair to say?
I think you're in the neighborhood. I disagree with your ultimate conclusion. I think it's less so a Croatia thing and more so a Zagreb thing. So if you notice the group of clubs, the top, with the exception of one, the top 5 or 6 clubs, or 7 even, are renowned for player development out of their academy. So if you think about profit margin, what is the cheapest player that you can acquire before you sell them for big money and make the most money? It's your academy players.
Youth player, yep.
Youth players, right? So that's why if you look at AZ Alkmaar, which is actually like a really small club in the grand scheme of things, but they've punched above their weight. They're one of the most kind of proactive, modern adopters of analytics in the last 10 years. Their profit margin is so high because they either buy really, really cheap, or a big bulk of that, they've had a tremendous youth development and academy system. So you're absolutely, this is why I said profit margin is nuanced, because you have to look at layers beneath that. I don't think PAOK, Maccabi Tel Aviv, Anderlecht, Slovan Bratislava, Feyenoord, Ghent, Victoria Plzen, I don't think those, all of which have 2 to 3 times the profit margin of Celtic, right? So again, it's not zeroing in on the best or the worst. It's kind of figuring out what the mosaic relative to the broader context might suggest. So you're right. The question is, okay, well, why aren't we developing youth players to sell them because they're cheap? That's a good question. We're not. We haven't been for a while. Okay, well then if that's not the business model, what's the business model? Well, the business model is to buy low and sell high. Well, the other teams that are doing that, we don't really rank very well with that either on profit margin, even though we're buying and selling a lot. So again, we see that, the total volume number, we see that where we rank there. So we're buying and selling a lot, not making a lot of money relative to our European peers, and we don't really have that academy pipeline in order to really make money off of low-cost talent sourcing. So
what I would say, though, as well, though, is I think if you did this exact exercise in another 10 years' time, and this is assuming all the other clubs stayed exactly the same as they are, I think we would feature higher up in that list, because I do think that we have dialed in what we are doing in terms of that approach much better. I would even say maybe in the last 5 years. So, excluding the Jota one because that was winning a lottery ticket, but the sale of Tierney, the sale of O'Reilly, the sale of Kuhn, I think our ability to buy players for a few million and sell them for somewhere between 15 and 25 million will become more frequent in the years to come, because I do think that is a more deliberate tactic that we are using than we were using in 2016 or something similar.
Yeah, I think so. I don't have the visual. I was going to load it up, but I didn't preload this one. So I don't disagree with you. That's possible. But I had, as part of the analysis I'd done back in February, I looked at the change in profit margin between the first half of this period and the second half of this period for exactly that point. Because what's happened is the inflation has accelerated, partly because of the monetary environment, I would argue. I mean, that inflation's accelerating everywhere. So obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but as a corollary to that, it's also accelerated in football. Our profit margins got worse between those two periods. Yeah, so I
mean, I guess all I'm doing here as an exercise is presenting to you what people will be thinking looking at this.
I agree. And that's why I wanted you to ask, because it'll be the type of questions or some of the stuff that people are thinking. That's a very logical, plausible thesis. I think the issue, because our spending's gone up too. So again, this is about the total volume going up. So yes, we've made these big sales, but we have started. Last year we bought, 20 million on 26 million on 3 players. Like that was unprecedented. So so I agree with you in concept. It could happen. I don't see much evidence of it happening yet. And more so, I think the important part is anchoring what's actually happened. Like I'm trying to paint a picture of benchmarking the past to inform what's likely to happen in the future, because we can't predict the future for sure, obviously. Yeah. So now I said I wanted to return to, because we don't want to go too long here, this board to supporters ratio. And this is like a cheeky little way that I've gone about doing something here. Is basically all I've done here is each of the seating capacity of these clubs is publicly available. And I've taken that amount and multiplied it times a flat, again, this is an exercise, it's not to be accurate, a flat €700 proxy for a season ticket to create an amount of money. And then compare that to what the amount of player trading profits have been to create a kind of ratio. So basically one season ticket revenue amount from the supporter base and relative to the amount of player trading profits over the last 9 seasons. And why I call this the board to supporters ratio, it's like, well, we all have our jobs, right? Supporters are pumping money into the club. We hope that the money's, going to help the business, which is competing on the pitch. And then the board's doing what they're doing. And, the whole thesis of this is a lot of what they've been doing has benefited from inflation. How much of it's actually like them being good at what they're doing? So if relative to player trading, if you look at these ratios, again, you kind of line up, and this goes back to big clubs versus smaller clubs. So you get a club like Alkmaar that, I don't know, I didn't load that, but I have the seating capacity. I mean, their seating capacity might be, I don't know, 10 or 15,000 or something. It's not a big season ticket book that they're bringing in. So their ratio is 16-1. That's how much money that they've made in player trading relative to one season of season ticket money. And again, you come down, we were the largest ratio in Scotland, right? We had 1.13, which was better than any of those other clubs in that first graphic. But if you look at across Europe, when people say that the Celtic supporters are really floating things financially, I think there's pretty good evidence that is actually the case, and that the people in control of player trading, at least, are not pulling their weight. So whatever that model is, and whoever's doing it, it's not working. Objectively, it has not worked. We benchmark poorly. Despite all of this talk of Celtic being a good player trading club, I objectively think it's the opposite. And this goes back to, for example, when you're in an inflationary environment and you make a mistake in the transfer market, like Telio, I'm going to say Telio is a mistake. If you buy a guy 2 years ago and you can get out of him for the same amount, potentially 2 years later, was that, smart, or was it maybe prices were just going up and you were able to get out of it at the same price? Not because he's worth the same, but because prices went up.
And
right?
Also, it would actually be considered a loss if there's been inflation in that period of time.
Well,
to an
in
extent.
real terms.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you discount the real purchasing power of money, which is why inflation is immoral, because it takes away the people's purchasing power that can least afford it.
And just to try and head off some people in the comments, again, we are just to stress, this is an exercise on player trading. Trading. You cannot come back to us with, well, we do the best commercial deals, we've got the best shirt sponsorship, we do this much in merchandise.
That's because of the supporters. That's because we're all lunatics.
Yeah.
That's because the fan base is so devoted and lunatics for following the club.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. Like, maybe they, there's a joke in the U.S. Like Roger Goodell, who's the commissioner of the NFL, makes like, I don't know, $50 million a year. And it's like, you could put me loaded on a case of beer into a room with the media companies, and I'd be able to cut a good deal with NFL media rights. It's like, it's the only game in town. Right?
Yeah, ultimately, they want to pay for it. So they will.
Yeah. So it's a question of, if they're negotiating with Adidas, well, they're delivering this huge fan base that are going to buy almost anything that's put out repeatedly. Right.
Yeah.
That's the fan base. It's not, I don't think, anything particularly brilliant that's being done. Negotiating.
Yeah, but even just from that point of view, is there are other revenues by which Celtic
100%.
will be financially superior in a lot of ways, but what we're talking about here is strictly as much as we can narrow it down, a player trading model. Well,
and this is the one that moves the needle, right?
Yeah.
So this is the one. They're not going to raise prices on season tickets 100%. So this is the lever that clubs pull, like Alkmaar, like Salzburg did, like Midtjylland. You look at the clubs up there that have PSV, that have moved up the notches of competitiveness in European circles, that have used player trading in order to do that. And by the way, it's stated as a strategic objective by our board, saying that we want to be world class in this. We're objectively not. Now, why get into any of this? So I wrote a piece that was released on Monday on Huddle Breakdown. .com, talking about the new competitive landscape in the league. And Al and I have talked about it large part of the second half of last season, and talked about how all this summer we were going to talk about it, because we're in this sea change because of what's happened with the people that own Leeds coming into Rangers and Antony Bloom going into Hearts. And these are relatively sophisticated people, regardless of what one thinks about their decisions to do these things. And this is the kind of analysis that they will have done to say, gee, is there a league that we can move into where we can get a bigger share of the pie in this inflationary environment, where we can get access to Europe because there's this club that's been dominating for all these years. They're maybe not all that well run. And if we can, if I'm Rangers and I could run Rangers at 80% wage bill of Celtic, but I can get up into, the Feyenoord group of player trading. I mean, I'm not saying that they're going to become, a Tony Bloom club like USG and explode their player trading in 3 years. I'm not saying any of that. But if they just get up to kind of middle of the peer group, they close that financial gap. And if they're able to do it on a conveyor belt and player trading basis, that's something that you can make season after season after season. And the new vice chairman of their board, the guy who's on the board at Leeds, explicitly said, we're not competing just by spending money. We're competing because we want to be smarter. This is what that is. They're smarter is a combination of player trading for profits, but also being smart about signing players that fit the style of play, not miscasting Joe Pesci as Romeo. And that's
not doing a Wrexham, which right. I think is a little bit more. You have millions of pounds, and that'll get you a certain distance.
Right. So they have a different business model, which is they're making money on media, and they spend a chunk of stuff that I don't think they've embraced analytics in any way. They're just throwing money at the problem, quote unquote, the problem to get competitive. I question whether they're going to be able to do that in the championship. I think, and it will reach
a ceiling. Certainly.
Well, they're trying to raise capital because I don't think they can fund it. With media, gambit that they've used. And gambit's too insulting. It's been an interesting business model. Like they've done a lot getting up into the English Championship. But there's different models. So there's different reasons. Like Brighton does not show well on some of these metrics because Brighton's key is to stay in the English Premier League because they get so much money from the media rights of just being in the league. And if they can get up into the Europa League, that's a different optimization than if you're Union Saint-Gilloise, where you actually have a legitimate shot at winning the league. Oh boy, they just won the league. Or if you're Tony Bloom and you move into Hearts and you say, I want to disrupt. He's not coming to disrupt. He's coming to win the league. You can think he's nuts. That's fine. But that's what he's come to Hearts to do.
But that's why you wouldn't include. I'm trying to think of a comparable sized English club. But you wouldn't include any of them. Say Crystal Palace that are going to be in the Conference League this year, not the Europa League, and we all know why. Even though they're probably about the same size as most of the clubs on the screen here, you wouldn't include them because their financials are so overinflated purely through being in the Premier League.
Correct. And that's why I limited this to non-Big Five teams. And again, I eliminated Ajax, Benfica, and Porto because they have such a gravy train of player trading because of where they and how they've sourced talent over decades of culture and intellectual property and all of that other stuff that you're not just going to wave a wand or snap your fingers and replicate that. That's a real moat. Now, we talked about this before we went live. Salzburg, one of their big strategic advantages that populate, this goes into your comment about what the future might lie, and these things are dynamic. These things change, as you said. Salzburg had a relatively early move into Africa and had a pipeline of talent that was effectively an academy type of movement of talent for cheap out of Africa, and that flowed a lot into these bawdy numbers that you see in this exercise. That's now starting to become a lot more competitive. There's a lot of people who've moved into Africa now. So they had a first mover advantage. A lot of people go into Brazil, but you know what? Benfica, Sporting, there's a big connection, natural connection, legacy and history between Portuguese clubs and Brazil. Salzburg into Africa, less so. So, so these are all just snapshots in time and exercise. These things are all dynamic, but most importantly, I think it lays out a case as to why these people have come to Scotland, partly. And some of that is a profiling of how well Celtic have been run, and that they see Celtic as vulnerable to be toppled, is my guess. Like if I was opposition person or doing this kind of work. Like I look at this and say, yeah, these guys are ripe for the taking. So I suspect that's probably why. Not how do we head that off? I mean, you've got to change who's doing the player trading. You've got to invest. You've got to embrace modernity, and I worry that it's going to require pain before that happens. That's ultimately how these things often happen with human nature. But
yeah, and as we've said before, damned if either of us know who's actually doing the player trading at Celtic, because they are about as transparent as, I don't even know what word I would use for it, but they are not transparent at all. So we'll see where we end up, but the suggestion of what you've presented there is that there is a potential that we could be being run an awful lot better than we are being, and that some of the perceived good business that we have done has perhaps been a little bit more luck than judgment, I would say, over the last few years.
Yes, the Saudis deciding to go out of their minds and buy Jota for $25 million was not strategic.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to say it because he is no longer with us, but I genuinely did wonder at the time whether they had got our Jota mixed up with Diogo Jota and have just made an absolute mess of
Somebody
that.
hit autofill on Jota and
yeah,
I got the wrong first name.
Exactly. So who knows? But no, interesting stuff anyway. And as I said before, if you're listening on audio only at the moment, if you want to visit the YouTube channel or if you want to visit huddlebreakdown.com, all the graphics that we've discussed today will be there. We'd love to hear your thoughts on some of it. Maybe you have some theories as to why we sit where we do on the charts that James has provided. What I would actually love to see is if anybody can come up with a really good way of building a model, so to speak, to compare us to these clubs in a different way, perhaps, that maybe gives us a different perspective on things. If you want to submit that to us to consider at a future date, then these thought exercises are something that I think we can really get our teeth into and break down. And while James can understand the intricacies of it, I can look at it and go, what does that bit mean? And that's what I'm here to do. James, thank you very much for that. Thank you to everybody watching and listening. Not long to go until the new season. Hopefully we'll get a few signings in before then, but we really appreciate everybody keeping in touch with us and keeping listening over the summer, because it really has been a good sort of bridge between the end of last season and the start of this season. James, do you have anything else you want to add before we head off?
I'll tease. I did a really good interview with a prominent industry person late last week that we'll probably be releasing before the end of the month. So look forward to that. About an hour conversation on all things analytics. But yeah, other than that, just keep up with us at huddlebreakdown.com. And that's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We will see you all again next week.